Before I get to the sermon, I've got to tell you, I thought I had it with the twins. I had thought through everything. I knew I could carry twins. If they spit up, that wasn't going to be a big deal. I've been spit up on before. If they cried, that's not a big deal. The one thing I hadn't considered is, what happens if Peyton pulls off my microphone and I've got no hand to put it back? I had not thought through that one. All right, there are various different ways this adage plays out. One version of this adage is that if you touch your toes every day till you're 90, you'll be able to touch your toes when you're 90. Another version of it goes this way. If you lift up your son when he's an infant over your head and do it every day, then when he's a grown man, you'll be able to lift him over your head. Makes sense, right? The more your capacity grows, the better chance you have of taking on a difficult task. Well, for the last 6 weeks, I've been preaching through the parables, leaving the parable of the dishonest steward to last, hoping that that would hold true. Because this one is really tough. I thought by the time I get to 6 weeks through the parables, I'll be able to lift this one over my head, and now I'm not so sure. This is a parable about a trusted overseer who betrays the confidence given to him, and then his master commends him. It makes a hero out of a villain. And it's Jesus, our Jesus, who tells the parable of a dishonest steward who is praised by the boss who just fired him. And we're supposed to learn something out of that about the nature of the kingdom of God. This one's not easy. You might be thinking with Augustine of Hippo, who said about this parable, I can't believe this story came from the lips of our Lord. How are we going to make sense of this story? I mean, consider this. You remember last week's parable, one of the characters in that parable dug a hole, buried his one talent, put it in the ground to keep it safe, which was a common practice in that era. It was a common practice for securing money. When his master returned, the servant who still had the talent gave it to his master, and his master banished the one talent man into outer darkness. And this week, the one entrusted with the master's money squanders it, covers dishonestly, and then he's commended for acting shrewdly. This is hard to understand. Now, one thing that is true about this parable, like a lot of our others that we've been through, are the big, oversized characters that we've talked about. We've talked about how the parables are big in scale to get our attention. The parables include huge parties and extravagant pardons and extraordinary punishments. Stories where Pharisees are bad guys and Samaritans are good guys, where a gardener fertilizes a dead tree and a woman shouts at a judge. We can't turn loose of the parables because of the size, the kind of absurdity of size, the surprise that creates all the startling contrast and make these stories so memorable. So as I retell today's story, listen for the size of the characters and the extraordinary actions. The steward, the supervisor of the estate, the CFO, is called in. The rich man, the owner, had been tipped off that he was cooking the books. The steward walks into the big corner office. The owner says to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give me the ledger. You're fired." And the manager has no response. Who knows why? Was he innocent and accused? We don't know. Was he finally caught and just felt too stunned, too guilty to move? Who knows? But then he goes away and he has an internal conversation that we get to hear. He says, what am I going to do now that I've been fired? And he considers two intolerable options. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. This guy has served the elite. He's a powerful man with great skills. He's been zipping around on a corporate jet, and you just don't go from being CFO to being a greeter at Walmart. He's not about to give up his business trips, the extended stays at the JW, dinners on expense account, and take a job wearing an orange vest and laying tar on surface streets. He thinks himself above the jobs that might be open to him. So what to do? He's desperate. He's soon going to be homeless, and he lacks the skills for the employment. And then he has an idea. This idea will get him welcomed into the homes of the business elite. This idea will not only get him invited over, but when the meeting is over, they will love him. And these are potential new employers. And he's got a scheme to win them over. So he begins making the appointments to the accounts to the people who owe money to his boss. He goes to the first, and he's a little bit in a hurry in these appointments. After a few hurried moments of hospitality, he finally gets to it. He opens up the briefcase that has the company logo on it. You see, he's still playing the ruse. They still think he's an employee of the company. They don't know he's been fired, so he continues to act on the authority of the rich owner. And he says to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He answers, 100 jugs of olive oil, about 900 gallons. Well, you see, barter is common in this culture, but this is a huge debt. This debt would be about the value of what a laborer would earn in 3 years. This is big money. And he says, "Take your bill, sit down, and make it 50. I'll cut it in half." And you see, he cut his bill in half and, importantly, made a friend. He visits account after account in hurried fashion because the clock is ticking, and he knows when he's found out the gig is up, and he goes and asks another, and this time in our scripture in only 4 words in Greek because the clock is ticking and this is urgent. He goes to the next one in hurried fashion and says, "And how much do you owe?" The business owner said, 100 containers of wheat. We'll take your bill and make it 80. And another important friendship secured before the clock runs out on his scheme. But now the clock has run out. And he's back in the corner office facing the music on this dishonest scheme. And the manager gets up from his desk and the steward tenses. The manager comes over to him and he squares up like this might be a fight. And the manager puts his arm around him and says, "Well done." And he commends the dishonest steward because he acted shrewdly. He says to him, "You rogue, this is so clever." I know, what do we do with this? In my study, I have several books of sermon collections, just volumes of sermons. I have about 3 shelves full of other people's sermons. So when I get stumped on one of these, I go thumbing through those to find how somebody else has preached a really difficult text. I mentioned 3 shelves worth. I'm rummaging. 8:15 on Wednesday morning, I'm rummaging. I'm trying to. In all of those volumes, I found one sermon on the dishonest steward. It was by George Buttrick in a book published in 1928. So I went to the 9 books I have that are just on the parables. 9 books just on the parables. And 3 of the 9 included anything at all about this one. There's not much help to be found. But these few books agree on this one insight. And you have to lean really close to even see it, but it's there. One way to unlock the parable is to recognize that the steward is not being commended for being dishonest, but for being astute. He's being held up as an example of resourcefulness and not as a hero of corruption. Listen again. He commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. So perhaps the rich man's affirmation was that the manager was so ingenious when the stakes were high. When it became life or death, will I have food to eat, will I have a place to stay? When there was urgency and serious consequence, the manager acted creatively. He got on with it with a kind of consuming eagerness because the children of this age are shrewd. Now, we've got 1,000 stories of how the children of this age are shrewd. I'll tell a couple. For instance, in 2007, there were 2 brothers who owned supermarkets in New Jersey. And they pled guilty to running a 4-year coupon redemption scam. Now, this is clever. This is how this worked. The 2 of them and a female accomplice scammed over $1 million in a 4-year period. The accomplice, Barbara Kessler, operated H&B Handling Corporation, a company that collects and submits grocery store coupons to be redeemed. Now, the 2 brothers had grocery stores, which means they had big stacks of papers. They're coming in, they're putting huge stacks of the Sunday paper down, and who's going to miss a few coupons out of the middle of a Sunday paper? So they're in there pulling coupons. Hundreds of coupons. And then they put those coupons in with the legitimate coupons, and pretty soon you're cashing in. If Lipton Tea is offering $1 back on their jumbo box of tea bags, you put a couple of hundred extra coupons in there, suddenly you got a little money coming in. See, that's pretty clever. The children of this age are shrewd. About 2 months ago, I guess, I went on a 5-hour ride-along with a Buckhead police officer. It was on Sunday afternoon. I got home from church, took a nap. 5 o'clock, I'm at the police station, put on my bulletproof vest, and from 5 to 10 o'clock, I rode Buckhead with a Buckhead police officer. It was fascinating. And we're tooling around, and he said, "So, have you had anything stolen yet since you've lived in Buckhead?" I said, "No." He said, "Oh, you will." "Oh, thanks." He said, "There's really not much crime in Buckhead at all except property theft, but there's a lot of property theft." He said, "People from other parts of Atlanta, this is where they come to work. They get up in the morning and say, 'Let's go to Buckhead and steal some things,' because there's property to be stolen." And he said, they're getting smarter. And this is what makes it tougher on us. He said, last week, a group of guys stole 2 cars. They found a place that had expensive merchandise. They drove 1 car through the front door, walked right in, stole what they wanted, got in the other car, and went away. Left that car just sitting in the front door. Now that's pretty clever. The children of this age are shrewd. And when we hear stories like this, many of us respond by saying, what could they accomplish if they put that much creative energy into producing instead of taking? What could they do if they gave that much of themselves to doing good? Well, perhaps that's the point of the parable. The children of this age are shrewd. When there was urgency, desperation to the manager's situation, he became clever. He was creative and industrious and urgent and productive. And the manager said, the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. What if the children of light worked with that kind of creativity and urgency? What if we gave our best efforts to the enduring work of the life of faith? What if church didn't get what was left over, but our best? Maybe if we thought the stakes were high enough, our work for God's kingdom and Christ's church might be more engaged. Maybe the acts of goodness and our church offering might not be the leftovers, but might be our best stuff because the stakes are so high. This morning when I was walking Harper and Peyton around, look, they've done like most of you, they've fallen asleep during the sermon. That's great. Here's what you pledged to them. I'm going to remind you again. Next week, they're going to be in the nursery. And one of you is going to be holding them and loving them and telling them this is a loving and safe place. And then soon they'll get older and we'll teach them the stories of our faith, and they will memorize scriptures that will get all the way into their bloodstream. And then they will form friendships, and those friendships will help them into a kind of peer pressure toward good, noble living. One day, Vacation Bible School or at children's camp or maybe even in the worship service, they're going to hear something that will trigger for them that the abundant life was meant for them, that the resurrection means that their lives might be saved from selfishness. And they'll come up here and be welcomed by me. And then you all will celebrate when they're baptized because you'll know you were a part of what that meant for them because you held to your covenant. Then they'll get to adolescence and the storms will come because they always do, and their faith will get tested. And when it does, they will have a community here. And they will have mentors and youth leaders who will talk to them and pray with them. And one day they'll go to college and they'll prepare themselves to contribute, to equip themselves for a life of giving. And eventually they'll find someone to love. Michael, I know this part hurts, but hang with me. They'll find somebody to love and somebody who loves them. And somebody who wants to help them be all of who God created them to be. And you might get invited to the wedding here too. And it'll be here, and you'll remember that you pledged to model for them what the faith is all about. The stakes are high. It demands our very best effort. Is there any higher stake than what we've been called to do as the people of God? And 78,000 people live in Buckhead. Is there any urgency at all about creating this same possibility for those other children who live here? If we think the stakes are high enough, we will. If you believe the stakes are high enough, you might raise your hand to serve. You might increase your giving. You might invite somebody to church this week. And I'm just getting started, because who knows? Who knows how shrewd and creative you will become if you really believe it's important? How will you respond?